Thanks, Dora, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I was saying to Yanis just now, I'm going to be provocative, hopefully with data to support what I'm going to say. So if you want to come at me in the questions, then feel free. So I'm going to talk about optimizing health and the role of physical activity, and whether we should consider one size fits all, and why we should maybe think more about fitness and strength than we have done. You've probably all seen this slide. So this is a slide from 2012, published in the Lancet series on physical activity, and basically it shows that physical inactivity is responsible for broadly a similar number of deaths worldwide as smoking, and this audience doesn't need to be reminded of this, but we consider smoking to be a really big public health problem, and physical activity is at least as big. And because of that, we have guidelines on how much physical activity people should do, and the new UK guidelines were released in September. And they're very similar broadly to what was the guidelines said before, with a couple of changes. The changes are in red. So we often say that to do 150 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous activity, but now importantly, there's that top line in red, which is some is good, more is better. So it's not that there is a minimum amount of physical activity that you need to do to get benefit. And then in the older guidelines, it said that the physical activity only done in bouts of 10 minutes could count towards your physical activity total, and that's now been knocked out. And there's a subtle change as well, actually. If you look at the order of the points, muscle strengthening activities was always in there, but it's the bit of the guideline that most people don't do, and it's been shifted in order to try and increase the emphasis. And if you look at the infographic on the left, the build strength bit is in the middle. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, and that, we hope, will change people's thought of the importance of muscular strength. So I'm just going to focus on the aerobic activity parts of it, and some of this is how little can you get away with. So this is a slide from the US Physical Activity Guidelines document, and what it shows is the dose-response relationship between physical activity and all-cause mortality. And it was interesting, I did a session with my MSc students last week, and I just hand drew that line. I said, where would you put the guideline? Right. And they said, that's a stupid question, you can put it anywhere. Which I think is probably about right. So you can actually put the line anywhere, which is why the line says sort of some is good, more is better, because you've got a steep initial part. And the guidelines actually put there. So at 150 minutes of self-reported physical activity, and that amount of activity is associated with about a 30% lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And if you look at how many people achieve that guideline, when they write down, when they complete a questionnaire to say how physically active they are, you find that half to 60% of the population meet those guidelines. But then when you put an accelerometer on people and measure how much activity they do, you find it's a lot lower. So I don't think you can read the lines there, but the dark red lines are the proportion of men and women of different age groups who are meeting the guideline by self-report, and the smaller bars are the people that meet the guideline by objective measurements of physical activity. So it's less than 10%. So we think, is this a really big problem? Are we much less active than we think? And is physical inactivity a really, really important problem? 90% of people aren't being physically active enough, because that's the interpretation that you often see. I'm going to argue something slightly different. So this is a paper that we published a few years ago. It's actually had nearly 400 citations now, in which we did something quite simple. We got about 300 people, and we got them to self-report their physical activity using the IPAC questionnaire. You can see that on the x-axis on the left, and then on the y-axis, you've got the accelerometer measured physical activity. And if you look at the line at 45 degrees, that's the line of equality. So if people actually do what they say they do, all those points will lie on that line. And they don't. They lie below the line. And you can see the lower line there. That is the best fit regression line. And so what you find is people over-report how much physical activity they do by 2-3-fold. Now, the important bit is the graph on the right. So what you find is if you divide people into quartiles of physical activity by how much they say they do, so the people that report the lowest 25% of the population up to the biggest 25% of the population, you get the white bars on the right. And if you look at the relationship between triglyceride concentrations in the blood and the self-reported physical activity, you don't find any clear relationship. But if you look at the bars in black, that is the objectively measured physical activity. You divide them into quartiles for that. You see a nice dose-response relationship. And that's what we see, that if you measure something poorly, i.e. measuring physical activity by questionnaire, you diminish the apparent effect on, or apparent association with an outcome. It's called regression dilution bias. The error is always in that direction. If you measure something poorly, the association with an outcome is lower. Right, so most of the epidemiology that we've used to base our physical activity recommendations on is on self-report. So poorly measured physical activity. Now, recently, in the last decade or so, there have been epidemiological studies which have used accelerometers. And Ulf Eklund published a meta-analysis on this a few months ago in the BMJ. So what we've got here is objectively measured physical activity using an accelerometer and hazard ratio for mortality in a number of studies in this meta-analysis. And what you find there is if you look at the dotted line, that dotted line is the amount of objectively measured physical activity you need to do to get a 30% lower risk of mortality. So if we go back again, 30% lower risk of mortality with 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week self-reported. If we go to objectively measured, it's 5 minutes a day, 35 minutes a week. So the amount of objectively measured physical activity you need to do to actually substantially lower risk is actually much, much lower than we think from self-report. Now, that is an amount which is probably achievable. I mean, we can probably get most people to do 5 minutes of actual physical activity per day. And I'm going to show you an example of a study that we did, which was led by, so it's a study led by Sally White, which was called Eurofit. And Eurofit was a really innovative study because what it did is it took into account the fact that men don't really respond to lifestyle intervention. Most of the large lifestyle intervention trials have been dominated by women. Some of this might be due to the social pressures that women have in society to look a particular way. So women tend to be more engaged in health and more interested in losing weight and physical activity. And men are very difficult to reach. And particularly men in the lower socioeconomic groups are very difficult to reach. And what Eurofit, which was a follow-on from the FIT study which was done in Scotland did, which was innovative, was take account of the fact that men tend to like football. And if your football club tells you to do something or asks you to do something, you might be more likely to do it than if your doctor did. And so this intervention was based in top-level football clubs throughout Europe. So there were 5 clubs in England. It was Arsenal, Manchester City, Everton, Stoke and Newcastle, I think. 3 clubs in Portugal, Benfica, Sporting Lisbon and Porto. 3 clubs in the Netherlands and 3 clubs in Norway. And what happened was we trained the club coaches to deliver the intervention, and there was about 1,100 men that went through this intervention, and we looked at changes in physical activity and sedentary behavior at 1 year and measured the effects on biomarkers of health. And one thing that we did that was quite neat in the study is we took advantage of the fact that we know that pedometers are a really effective way of increasing physical activity. They work on, they have a personal goal that's being set, you have feedback and self-monitoring, and because of this we know that if you give somebody a pedometer supported program where you give people goals to increase physical activity, they follow it with pedometers, they increase their physical activity. Now if we want to reduce sedentary behavior, so sedentary behavior is what you're doing now, it's sitting down, if you have a similar type of device, a sitting pedometer, it might be helpful in getting you to change your sedentary behavior. So what we did is we worked with PAL Technologies to develop this device here that you can see, which was called the SitFit. And the SitFit works because it sits in your pocket, and it's a triaxial accelerometer. So, so on your phones, well, you know, if you turn the screen that way, the screen moves, so you can it knows which way up it is. And the reason it does is you've got 3 accelerometers in, and it knows gravity is going that way. So basically, it knows which way up it is, and it can orient. So if you have something in your pocket which does the same thing, if your leg is like that, it knows it's that way up, and if your leg's like that, it knows it's that way up. So it can monitor whether you're sitting or being upright, and give you feedback on your sitting and standing behavior as well as your steps. And this was part of the program which we used to try and change sedentary behavior and physical activity. And so this is long story short. So at 3 months, we increased physical activity, steps, by 11 minutes objectively, and at 12 months, 6 minutes, which sounds a little bit disappointing. We didn't change objectively measured sitting time at all at 12 months. There was a 1 minute change. If we look at self-reported data, we reduced sitting by an hour, and we increased physical activity by 32 minutes. So this is really important to know that when you objectively measure versus self-report, you get different answers. But we did change physical activity a little bit. But importantly, that 6 minutes a day of physical activity was sufficient to produce substantial changes in a number of biomarkers of health. So we reduced weight, we reduced blood pressure, we reduced insulin, we reduced triglycerides, we reduced liver enzymes. So even though it was a relatively small amount of physical activity changed by, and we would ideally have wanted to change physical activity by more, that amount was enough to actually cause some substantial changes. So I guess the first take-home message is the amount of objectively measured physical activity needed for substantial health benefits might be less than we think. And if the target is we need to get people to do 5 or 6 minutes per day of proper documented physical activity, that might change our approaches to increase physical activity, because you can do that by walking up and down the stairs a few times, if that is the amount that you actually need. So it might change our approaches and how we try and increase physical activity. The second concept I want to talk about is whether one size fits all for lifestyle. And this is a concept that Ashley Cooper and I wrote about in a review we wrote a few years ago in Sports Medicine. So what you've got here is we know that the relationship between physical activity and risk of mortality or a number of adverse health outcomes is curvilinear. So you get the biggest benefit from the first amount that you do, and then you get a plateau. Now, you've got the black line is people that are low-risk populations, and the dotted line is high-risk populations. So you've got a similar curvilinear relationship, but if what we want to do is get people to low risk, which is the blue bit at the bottom, the amount that the low-risk group needs to do to get into that low-risk box is lower than the high-risk. So if we say our goal is to get people's risk to be low, the high-risk person needs to do more activity than the low-risk. And what we're doing at the moment is saying both groups of people do the same thing. We've got one guideline which doesn't differentiate what people's baseline risk is. And I'll give you a few examples about how the effects of physical activity might differ according to someone's baseline risk. This is a study that we published a long time ago where we got some lean people, so these were people with waists of less than 100 centimeters, they were middle-aged men, or centrally obese, waists of more than 100 centimeters. We got them to do an exercise session or not on one day, and we fed them a mixed meal on the next day. And on the graph on the left, what we can see is the insulin response to the meal. So in blue, we've got the control trial response, and in red, we've got the exercise trial response. And what we see in the lean subjects, they've got a very low insulin response. They're insulin sensitive. Exercise doesn't improve it further. But on the right, if you take the obese people, they've got a higher response, and it does improve with exercise. So exactly the same exercise is doing a different thing depending on someone's level of baseline risk. Another example you can see from epidemiology, this is the relationship between participating in vigorous exercise and risk of diabetes according to BMI. So you've got quartiles of BMI. On the number 1 is the people with the lowest BMI, on 4 is the highest BMI. And what we find is if you have BMI in the bottom half of the population, how physically active you are doesn't seem to influence your risk of developing diabetes. But if you've got a high BMI, it does. So you've got a different association between physical activity and risk of diabetes depending on who you are. This is a study that we did recently. So what we, well, not recently, it's published 10 years ago. I'm getting old. What we did is we got people who had a family history of type 2 diabetes. So there were women who either had a family history of type 2 diabetes or not. So one group had at least one parent with type 2 diabetes. The other group had no family history of type 2 diabetes. And we know that if you have a family history of type 2 diabetes, you're more insulin resistant and you've got a much higher risk of developing diabetes. For example, I've got 2 parents with type 2 diabetes. My lifetime risk of developing type 2 diabetes is 90%. So I've got a very, very high risk of developing diabetes because of my family history. And what you find is these were groups, young women aged mid-30s. We see on the left, pre-intervention, the offspring were less insulin sensitive. So they're the white box. We then did an intervention, a 7-week exercise training program, and what you find is they're much closer together on the, if you look on the right, after the intervention. If we look at the inset, which is the change in insulin sensitivity in response to the intervention, you've got a 3 times bigger improvement in the family history, people with family history compared to the people who have not. So what we've got is a number of examples where the people at highest risk seem to get the biggest benefit from being physically active. And so these are the people I would argue that we really need to target to become more physically active, because they're the people at the highest risk and they're the people that get the biggest benefit. I'm going to give you another example. So this is data that we've looked at from UK Biobank. A UK Biobank is a fantastic resource. It's a large epidemiological study of 500,000 people across the UK, where they had a range of baseline measures taken, and they're being followed up. The follow-up now is about 9 years, and they're going to be continued to be followed up forever. And one thing that was taken in UK Biobank was genetic information. And we were able to look at the association between genetic risk for obesity and physical activity and people's BMI. So what you find with genes for obesity is there's not a single gene which puts you at risk of obesity. There's lots and lots of genes which have a small effect, and people have one version or other of them. And what we did is we put together a genetic risk score depending on which version of 93 genes that you have. And it's a weighted score, so some genes have a bigger effect and some genes have a smaller effect. And what we then did is classified people into 4 quartiles of genetic risk score. So quartile 1 are the people who have the lowest genetic risk of obesity, quartile 4 have the highest genetic risk. And what we can see is if you just look broadly on the left, from quartile 1 to quartile 4, is if you're in quartile 4, you've got a higher BMI than if you're in quartile 1. So having a higher genetic risk for obesity makes you heavier. Well, what we then did was look at how much physical activity people did. So what we've got here, if you look at the graph on the left, is the people in white have the highest levels of self-reported physical activity, and the ones in dark grey have the lowest amounts of self-reported physical activity. And we looked at the difference in BMI between those groups. And what you find is when you've got the high genetic risk for obesity, the difference in BMI between the inactive and active is greatest. So if you have a high genetic risk for obesity, how physically active you are is more important for your BMI than if you have a low risk. And that's true whether you look at self-reported physical activity on the left or objectively measured physical activity on the right. So if you've got a high genetic risk score for obesity, how physically active you are is more important for your BMI. That's also true for your level of fitness. If you have a low genetic risk for obesity, how fit you are has a smaller effect on your weight than if you have a high genetic risk. And also for a range of sedentary behaviors. For example, TV viewing seems to have a bigger association with your weight if you've got a high genetic risk score for obesity than if you have a low risk. One thing that, I've got a wee one, she's there. One thing that I've become more interested in recently for some reason is sleep. What you find is poor sleep is associated with risk of obesity and a number of adverse risk factors. So what you find is if you have a sleep duration of less than 7 hours or more than 9 hours, so short sleep and long sleep are associated with higher risk of obesity. And what we show again is that if you've got a high genetic risk for obesity, having poor sleep has a bigger association with your body weight than if you have a low genetic risk. If you have a low genetic risk of obesity, it seems that you can get away with adverse lifestyle to a much greater extent than if you have a high genetic risk. So in terms of sort of take-home messages, if someone says, look, doc, I'm really fat and it's all because of my genes, there's nothing I can do about it, what these data suggest is the absolute opposite of that. You are at a higher risk because you've got these adverse genes, but people with the adverse genes actually have a bigger effect of lifestyle. So the same lifestyle change is likely to have a bigger effect on your weight if you've got, so if someone says, it's all in my genes, you say, well, that means it's even more important that you're active, even more important. And there's sort of data on sort of sugary drinks and everything like that as well, which shows that if you've got a high genetic risk, your lifestyle is more important. I'm going to shift gears slightly to talk about ethnicity. So one of the things that we find is, if you look at most of the epidemiological studies, is they're done on people who are white European. And that's because a lot of the research has been done in Europe and North America and in places like Australia, where that's the population. And what we often do is take these populations and assume that what's happening in the white European populations is the same as all other populations in the world. And one thing, just as a reminder, is 5/6 of the world's population is not white European. So if we're trying to extrapolate to round the world, we have to be a little bit careful about saying something which occurs in one population isn't necessarily the same in other populations. So I wrote a review about it a wee while ago with Carlos Celis Morales and Nazim Ghauri, which I recommend that you read. But broadly, the story is this. If you look at risk of cardiometabolic diseases, and particularly diabetes, what you find is it's not an equal opportunities disease. It didn't go to school on the day that diversity training was taught. And what you find is the risk of diabetes in South Asians is about 4 times as high as white Europeans, and if you are Afro-Caribbean or black African, you've got about twice the risk. So what we've got is very different risks of diabetes depending on different ethnic groups. And I've spent a lot of the last few years trying to understand why is it the South Asians are at higher risk of type 2 diabetes, and is there anything that we can do about it? And this is a review that I wrote with Naveed Sattar in the Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology a little while ago, where we came up with this idea about what might be going on. And a lot of it is to do with we think about ability to store fat, but a really big proportion of it we think is to do with fitness and capacity for fat oxidation. So this is a study that we published a few years ago. So what we've got here is a group of young, so age 25-ish, lean, BMI 22, 23, Europeans and South Asians. We did a bunch of tests on them, but one of the things we did is put them on a treadmill and measure their VO2 max. And what we see is the South Asians' VO2 max, young, normal, thin people, is about 20% lower in South Asians compared to Europeans. We've since replicated that in at least 2 other studies, and others have shown the same thing. So it's not that every South Asian is less fit than every European. There's population distributions, but the mean seems to be slightly lower in South Asians. And we were wanting to find out how important that was in terms of understanding diabetes risk. And Nazim Gowri led a study that we published in Diabetologia that we published a few years ago, where we investigated the relationship between fitness and insulin resistance in South Asians and Europeans. Now, I've got a very complicated slide here. I'm going to try and do this without a laser pointer. On the y-axis, we've got insulin resistance. So on this, a higher number is bad, a lower number is good. On the x-axis, we've got fitness, VO2 max, lower number bad, higher number good. And what you find is, so every black dot is a South Asian person, every white dot is a European person. And what you see is there is a relationship such that the people who have higher levels of fitness have lower insulin resistance. Now, at the top, there is a vertical line which is the mean VO2 max in South Asians, and then there's a dotted line which is the mean VO2 max in South Asians, and you can see there's this difference. So South Asians have about 20% lower VO2 max. If you look on the sort of about halfway through, you see a line with sort of the insulin resistance level, log HOMA. So it's higher in the South Asians than Europeans. So what you can then do is statistically say, well, if we remove the difference in fitness, so we made every European and South Asian the same level of fitness, what would be the difference in insulin resistance? And what you find is that's the bar on the extreme right, is you get rid of about 2/3 of the difference. So about 2/3 of the difference in excess insulin resistance in South Asians can be explained by a lower level of fitness. Okay, so the way you get fit is by increasing your physical activity. So we've got a graph here of, on the y-axis, VO2 max fitness, on the x-axis, objectively measured physical activity. And we can see there's a line, and it goes up, so that if you do more physical activity, you appear to be more fit. There's two different lines. There's the solid line, which is in South Asians, and the dotted line in Europeans above. Now, what this is saying is that for any given level of physical activity, so let's say 40 minutes, the South Asians have a lower level of fitness than the Europeans. And if we read across, to say to get the same level of fitness, that means the South Asians need to do more. So if fitness is important, South Asians need to do more physical activity to get to the same level of fitness. We published a couple of papers looking at sort of cardiometabolic risk and this concept of how much activity do you need to do to get to the same level of risk if you're South Asian compared to if you're white European. And it looks like you need to do more. So about 100 minutes per week more physical activity to get to a similar level of risk. In the JBS3 recommendations, that was acknowledged that South Asians might need to do more physical activity than Europeans. But in the latest physical activity guidelines, both in the UK and US, there was the argument that there was not enough data yet to actually recommend different amounts of physical activity. And they say that the dose-response relationship is largely similar, so we're not going to make a differential recommendation. I think that's probably fair. At the moment, there's not enough evidence to give a differential recommendation. But interestingly, at the bottom, they said there is the evidence from socioeconomic status and physical activity is even more sparse, so we don't know whether different socioeconomic groups need to do different levels of physical activity. And I'm just going to show you some really exciting data that we just published in Lancet Public Health. Well, we didn't just look at physical activity, we looked at a global healthy lifestyle score, which was based on physical activity, how much fruit and veg you consume, alcohol, smoking, so we developed a score for healthy lifestyle. And this is data from UK Biobank in 500,000 people. And what we also did is looked at people's level of deprivation. So on the leftmost is the people who are the most affluent, the least deprived people. And then on the rightmost, they are the most deprived people. And we looked within each group at people that had the healthiest lifestyles, moderately healthy lifestyles, or unhealthy lifestyles, and looked at the hazard ratio for mortality. And what you find is that if you take the most affluent people if you have an unhealthy lifestyle, your risk of mortality increases a bit, right? But if you go to the farmost side, what you find is if you take the people who are the most deprived, that hazard ratio increases much, much steeper. So the same adverse lifestyles have a much bigger association with adverse health outcomes if you are poor compared to if you're rich. And this has implications on what we need to do. So what we find is, who are the people that are hardest to reach on lifestyle interventions? They're the people at the lower and those are the people that we need to meet. So the adverse lifestyles have a bigger association with those groups. So it's the hard to reach people that we really, really need to reach. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides to show that the idea that you have ethnicity-specific guidelines for health-related things is not new. So this is the NICE guidance for BMI, and what they say is we need to be using lower thresholds in people from Asian backgrounds, and saying that instead of using a BMI cutoff of 25 for normal weight and 30 for obese, we use 23 for normal weight and 27.5 for obese in South Asians. So they haven't been bold enough. I spoke to people that were involved with this. It's kind of a political sort of issue. The real number you need to get to is so low that it's quite difficult telling somebody that they need to lose weight when they're as small as that. So I'll show you what the real data show, and you can form your own conclusions. So what we know is there is an association between diabetes prevalence and BMI. So the higher your BMI, the higher the prevalence of diabetes. I'll do the data in men because it's clearer. So that bottom line in black is white Europeans. So if you take the BMI of 30, which we conventionally call obesity, and take the red line across, we'll see a certain prevalence of diabetes. So that we consider a BMI of 30 an appropriate BMI to act on, because we consider that level of diabetes prevalence as unacceptable and we need to act on this. So if we look at what BMI in different ethnic groups, you get to that same prevalence of diabetes. You've got this, the black line is actually two lines on top of each other, they kind of overlay each other for Chinese and black men. And what you find is that intersects at about a BMI of 26. And if you're South Asian, it's about a BMI of 22. So South Asians with a BMI of 22 have about an equivalent risk of diabetes as Europeans with a BMI of 30. So if you're going to have an ethnic-specific BMI threshold, it needs to be a lot lower. But then there's the issue that 95% of South Asians have a BMI of over 22, so you could just argue that all South Asians are at high risk and you could ignore the BMI, but that's a different argument. But there is a case for saying you've got different guidelines on weight, and I think we should have probably different guidelines on physical activity depending on who we are. Now, some of the reason for why South Asians are at high risk, we think, is due to differences in the muscle's ability to oxidize fat. And I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but basically, if you get a mismatch between fatty acids being delivered to muscle and the ability of the muscle to burn fat, you get a buildup of lipid intermediates in the muscle, which interfere with insulin signaling and make you insulin resistant. And so one of the things that we did is we measured fat oxidation in South Asian and European people, men, walking on a treadmill. And you've got on the x-axis different percentages of VO2 max, on the y-axis how much fat their bodies are burning. And what you find is the South Asians are burning about half as much fat. And when you exercise, most of the whole body fat oxidation is in skeletal muscle, as the Europeans. And the relationship between, there's a reasonably strong relationship between fat oxidation and insulin sensitivity measured at whole body level. And also we took muscle biopsies and measured insulin signaling in muscle, and you also get that relationship there. So people who don't burn fat so well during exercise have poorer insulin sensitivity, both at a whole body level and at the level of insulin signaling. So we've got a grant with the MRC at the moment where we're trying to understand a little bit more about those relationships. Particularly what we're trying to understand is whether the insulin resistance is actually in the microvasculature in muscle, so whether it's the small blood vessels within in muscle which don't dilate as well, or it actually was in the mitochondria. So we're doing this study in collaboration with Anton Wagamaker's group at Liverpool John Moores University, and we're looking at the effect of exercise interventions, both resistance exercise and aerobic exercise, to see what the changes are. So I think this is really exciting. We'll hopefully understand more about insulin resistance, but also more about how both aerobic and resistance exercise improve insulin sensitivity mechanistically. Okay, so summarize that section. The benefits of physical activity on health outcomes appear to be greatest in those with the highest risk. So the thing is, should we be advising those at high risk to do more? And at the moment we don't. And I just wonder whether that is something that we should be doing. Okay, I'll ask you a question. Which is more important for health outcomes? How physically active you are, or your level of cardiorespiratory fitness? So just a show of hands. Who thinks it's how physically active you are? And who thinks it's how fit you are? Okay, it's not all the hands. We've got an election coming up. It's really, really important to vote. So we'll do this again. You have to vote. Even if you don't know the answer, you have to make a call. So who thinks it's physical activity? Okay, about half. And who thinks it's fitness? Okay, about half. So this is like Brexit. Okay. So if you look at sort of data when you take the epidemiology and you look at the association between physical activity and this is risk of mortality, you see it's that top line and fitness is the bottom line. So it's a bit steeper for fitness. Fitness is likely to be causal. So I don't know whether you're familiar with the work that Ulrich Wisloff and colleagues have done, where they've taken rats and they basically run them on a treadmill and find out the rats that are good at running and the rats that are bad at running, and they kind of interbreed them generation on generation on generation. So you get sort of super rats at the end, and this is 11 generations in, who can run a really long way, and rats that can't run very far at all. And what you find is there's big difference in insulin sensitivity, and there's actually big differences in survival. So this is survival. So the low capacity, the unfit rats don't live as long. They live substantially less long than the fitter rats. So just breeding for the trait of fitness actually has an effect on life expectancy. Same's true in humans. So this is a really neat study. So this is a study, an epidemiological study with 46 years of follow-up. So they measured fitness in 5,000 Danish adults, middle-aged men, and followed them up for 46 years. And what you find is if you take people in the top 5% of the population for fitness versus the bottom 5% of the population for fitness, there's about a 4.9-year difference in life expectancy. So fitness seems to be important for life expectancy. But what we did quite recently, is look at a UK biobank to try and say, well, is there an interaction? Is there a relationship between how fit you are and how physically active you are and risk? So what we've got here is about 76 people in the UK biobank did a fitness test, a cyclogometer test, and we divided people into the top, middle, and bottom third of the population for age and sex-specific fitness. So the grey is people in the top third for fitness, the green middle third, red bottom third. Now within each of those groups, well across all the groups, we looked at the level of physical activity. So we divided them into quintiles of physical activity. So bottom 20% of physical activity is Q1, top is Q5. Now if we take people that have the lowest levels of fitness, so that's the red bars, what you find is there's a pretty good relationship between how physically active you are and your risk of mortality. So if you've got a low level of fitness, how physically active you are appears to be important for your risk of mortality. But if you have a high level of fitness, a high level of physical activity but a low level of fitness, if you're in Q5, in that red Q5, your risk is low. If you've got a high level of fitness, it doesn't matter. Okay, even if you are completely physically inactive, your risk of mortality is low. So it's only in the people that have low levels of fitness that physical activity is important for mortality. So what we need to do is focus, I would argue, on the people who have low fitness and low physical activity rather than everybody that's physically inactive for public health. And if we think about it, those are probably the hardest people to target, because the people that have low levels of fitness are the people that struggled in PE and were the last people picked. They're probably the people that hate being physically active and would rather read a book. But in terms of public health, those are the people that we need to get active. We don't need the person who at age 40 starts running and realizes they're pretty good at it and wins the local 10K having done nothing. That's not the person that we need to be active. We need the person who really doesn't like physical activity and is really unfit if we want to really be serious about helping public health. Just going to move on briefly to looking at muscle strengthening exercise. So muscle strength is really important. So we published this paper in the BMJ last year, using UK Biobank again, where what we did is we looked at the association between grip strength and risk of a range of adverse health outcomes. And basically, lower strength is associated with increased risk of all health outcomes, pretty much. What we then did was say, well, if we take a risk scoring model, which takes into account age, sex, BMI, blood pressure, smoking, whether you have diabetes, and say, how well do you predict risk of disease in that group? And then you say, well, if you add grip strength to the model, do you improve risk prediction? The answer is yes, you do. So what we're arguing is potentially, grip strength is really easy to measure. And we're arguing that maybe when you go to see your GP, as well as getting your blood pressure measured, they should measure your grip strength because it helps predict risk. And what we find is if we look at the association between physical activity and strength and mortality, in people in the bottom third of the population for strength, there is a strong relationship, whereas in people who are in the top third of the population, it's pretty flat. So again, the people that need, if you're already strong, it probably doesn't matter how physically active you are, and we need to target the people with low strength. And unlike fitness, strength is really, really easy to measure. So we can actually, in supermarkets, measure people's strength and identify these high-risk people. So grip strength is a relatively strong predictor of health outcomes. Measurement of strength improves prediction over and above recent routine measures. Those with the lowest level of strength may benefit more from physical activity, so should we routinely screen for grip strength. I'm going to touch on sedentary behavior. So minimize time spent sitting is something which has been increasingly put into a number of physical activity guidelines. And so sedentary behavior is any waking activities where you're expending less than 1.5 METs in a sitting or reclining position. And if you look at the headlines on august journals such as the Daily Mail, what you find is sitting is more dangerous than smoking, and it's really sort of public enemy number one. And I would just like to sort of maybe push back on that argument a little bit. I did a debate with David Dunstan a couple months ago at the EASD, and I was arguing that we shouldn't focus on sedentary behavior. So I'm going to show you some of the arguments that I was making there. The first is that the amount of sitting needed to increase risk of adverse health outcomes is actually quite high. If you look at this meta-analysis on self-reported sitting, what you find is you get the first 8 hours free. Okay, so you sit down for up to 8 hours a day and it doesn't influence risk. Once you get above 8 hours per day, your risk increases by about 4% per hour. This is self-reported. Now, what you find is when you take self-reported sitting versus objectively measured sitting, you underreport by 1 to 2 hours. And the Eklund meta-analysis recently showed that you basically get an increase in risk only when you're sitting for more than about 9 hours a day. So you get the first 9 hours free. So it's not that every time you sit down to read a book or something, you're increasing your risk of mortality, which is sometimes how it's framed. The other thing I think that's important is when you look at how much sitting people do, is most people are in the range of 6 to 8 hours of self-reported sitting. Right? So most people are not in the range of sitting which is associated with an increased risk. So it might not be as big a public health problem as we think. And the other thing is, what do you want to do about it? If you take somebody that's sitting 10 hours a day and you get them to sit 9 hours a day, what's the change in risk? It's about a 17% change in risk and mortality. If you take somebody if you increase the amount of walking you do by 2.5 minutes, you have a 17% lower risk of mortality. Now, I'm going to argue that it's easier to get someone to do 2.5 minutes more walking than it is to sit down for an hour less. I know the arguments with sedentary behavior are people don't like being physically active, we'll just get them to sit down less. But the evidence, which I'm going to show you, suggests that the interventions that we do to try and reduce sitting don't work very well. We can't change sitting by the amounts that we need to. Another argument is a lot of the evidence is based on TV viewing. Because TV viewing is a sedentary behavior that's easy to measure. And you find associations with TV viewing and risk of mortality that are steeper than the relationships with sitting and risk of mortality. But one of the issues with TV viewing is it correlates really poorly with sitting. So the correlation coefficient is about 0.1. So you almost can't get lower than that. And we know TV viewing is heavily confounded by dietary intake and snacking, socioeconomic status, which is a huge risk factor for adverse health outcomes that we probably can't fully adjust for, and mental health. So we have to be really, really careful about extrapolating data from a subset of sitting to mean that it's something that all sitting is bad. The other argument is, this is data from Ulf Eklund's meta-analysis on the association between how physically active you are and how much sitting you do and risk of mortality. And the headline message was people that do at least an hour of physical activity per day are protected from the adverse effects of sitting. And then a lot of people said, well, nobody does an hour of physical activity per day. But I think that's misinterpreting what the data show. What the data actually show is people in the top quartile of the population for physical activity. So this is the top quarter of the people who self-report 5 minutes of physical activity, which we know is probably 20 minutes of physical activity per day. Their relationship is flat. It's also pretty flat in the next quartile. So about half the population we don't need to worry about. But if we take this person here, who is very inactive and sits a lot, how can they reduce their risk? Well, they can reduce their sitting. So they're moving from this sitting category of more than 8 hours a day to less than 4 hours a day. Or they can do self-reported walking by 20 minutes. You get the same point in risk. Similarly, with the person in that next category, 20 minutes of self-reported walking is equivalent to 4 hours of changes in sitting. I'd argue that changing sedentary behavior is hard, and option 2 is easier. If we look at the meta-analyses about how much we can change sitting, they suggest that all the interventions that we do can change sitting by about 30 to 60 minutes per day. So nothing like the 4 hours that we need to. And if you try and target changing physical activity as well as changing sedentary behavior, rather than just changing sedentary behavior, the effect is less clear on sedentary behavior. So we can't really change sedentary behavior very much. And if you try and change physical activity as well, we don't have a very big effect. And I'm just going to skip forward to our data from Eurofit, is we did a really big trial, and we couldn't change sedentary behavior, but we could change physical activity. So I think we are wasting effort to try and change sitting behavior, and we're much better off focusing our efforts on changing physical activity. I'm just going to talk about one project that I'm very excited about. So we published a paper in the BMJ in 2017, again based on UK Biobank, and what that showed is that if you commuted to work by cycle, you had about a 40% lower risk of mortality compared to if you commuted to work by non-active means. That's pretty big. It was a pretty important paper. It was out of the 2.2 million papers that were published in that year on the altmetric attention scale, it was number 18. So it was a pretty important paper. We were invited to the Department for Health, we were invited to the House of the Commons to talk about this work. But importantly, we got in contact with British Cycling and HSBC, who are the main sponsor of British Cycling, to say, well, can we develop an intervention to increase people's cycling? So what we've got is a project where we're going to try and increase sustainable long-term increases in the number of people cycling, the number of cycling journeys, and to measure the effect of such changes on health outcomes, well-being outcomes, and productivity outcomes. And productivity outcomes and economic outcomes is really important, because if we can demonstrate that, you get more employers to buy into it. So we've got a 4-phase program which is going to run for 5 years. We've developed a program. We published this report in the summer, which explains what we're trying to do. It's called Confidence to Ride and Confidence to Invest. We've developed a multi-component intervention which tries to address all the different barriers to people not cycling. Because if we think about barriers, we need to think about a lock, so a door with lots and lots of locks on it, and each barrier is a lock, and you have to undo all those barriers to get people to cycle. So we've got a multi-component program which is addressing all the barriers. We are pilot testing at the moment. We're hopefully going to roll out to randomized control, showing that it does what it says on the tin. We increase cycling and well-being outcomes at the moment. Does what it says on the tin, and hopefully we're going to do the largest ever randomized control trial of cycling in 40 different offices with HSBC across the country. And this is one of the most exciting things that I've ever done. And I think it's one of these opportunities where you can actually translate the research to actually practice. And if we can demonstrate that we can improve cycling in people that don't cycle, this is an opportunity to actually get many, many more employers and government on board, and we can actually, hopefully, make the country a little bit more like the Netherlands and Denmark. And so I think this is something that's really, really exciting, and it's to be continued. I'm going to skip some stuff on Malawi and to allow some time for questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. That was amazing. We love